In 1807, a former vice president of the United States is on trial for his life. The charge is treason. The penalty is death. The star witness against him is the commanding general of the U.S. Army, a man we now know was secretly on the payroll of a foreign government. Aaron Burr sits at the defense table. Across from him, testifying for the prosecution, is General James Willkinson, known to Spanish intelligence as Agent 13. Tonight we're asking, was Aaron Burr a traitor? Or was he the victim of one of the most corrupt officers in American history, backed by a vindictive president and a shaky legal case?
Before we get to Wilkinson and the conspiracy, let's back up a little bit. Who was Aaron Burr? At this point, all we know is he's the guy who shot Hamilton.
There was a lot more to him than that. Burr's resume before the conspiracy is impressive and ugly at the same time. He's born in New Jersey in 1756. He's a Revolutionary War officer who serves with Benedict Arnold during the Quebec campaign, is present at Arnold's betrayal, and later becomes a lieutenant colonel. After the war, he's a successful New York lawyer and politician, a U.S. Senator from New York, and vice president under Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1805. Politically, he's ambitious and ruthless. The 1800 election ends in an electoral tie between Jefferson and Burr. The House of Representatives has to break the tie. Jefferson becomes president. Burr ends up vice president, but Jefferson's camp never trusts him again.
And then the Hamilton duel in 1804 basically nukes what's left of his career in the East.
Exactly, Dr. Weaver. Burr kills Alexander Hamilton in the duel in New Jersey. He's indicted for murder in both New York and New Jersey, but he's never brought to trial, but his reputation is shot. By the end of his vice presidential term in 1805, Burr is politically toxic. He's still powerful, still ambitious, and suddenly has no clear future inside the system. That's the man who turns west and starts talking about big, vague projects. And that's where James Willkinson comes in.
So who exactly was this James Wilkinson? Because he's not a name that most people learned in school. At least I didn't.
At one time, you would have. James Wilkinson is one of the most corrupt figures in early U.S. history. He's born in 1757, also a Revolutionary War veteran and quartermaster. By 1800, he's the senior officer of the United States Army. Jefferson later makes him governor of Louisiana Territory, while he also remains the top military commander in the West. On paper, he's the man you'd trust to defend the frontier. In reality, he's taking a secret pension from Spain and working as a paid agent, codenamed Agent 13, feeding Spanish officials information about United States plans and policies in the West.
So the country's top general in the West is literally on a foreign payroll?
Yes, for years. And that man becomes Aaron Burr's main partner for a bold, reckless Western scheme.
Now let's talk about the Burr Conspiracy. What exactly was the plan supposed to be here?
Here's the core problem. 2.25 centuries later, we still don't have a fully clear picture. Even at the time, witnesses and documents don't line up perfectly. Most historians today think Burr was building an unauthorized military expedition, what was called a filibuster then, aimed at conquering Spanish territory, especially Mexico. Here's a basic outline based on letters, testimony, and later research. In 1805 and 06, Burr travels through Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee down the Mississippi River. He looks for men, money, and political backing. He meets an operator named Harmon Blanderhassett on Blanderhassett Island on the Ohio River, and that becomes a gathering and staging point. There's strong evidence Burr wants to lead volunteers into Spanish Mexico, overthrow Spanish rule, and carve out a new empire with himself at the top. Wilkinson is supposed to be his top military man. Rumors spread that Burr plans to detach Western states or territories from the U.S. and form a breakaway nation. He's going to do exactly what Napoleon did in France. Some contemporaries genuinely believe he wants to fracture the Union. Burr always denies planning treason against the United States. He says his goal is a campaign against Spain, not against the United States, something other Americans will later do throughout the 19th century in other filibuster expeditions in Latin America.
So we've got a freelance war on Spain on one side of the spectrum, and possibly a full-blown plan to carve off part of the country on the other. Is that right?
Exactly. Burr deliberately keeps things vague. He hints at grand outcomes and he tailors his promises to whoever he's talking to. That very ambiguity will be used against him later.
So, how deep exactly was Wilkinson in this scheme?
At the beginning, very deep. Burr and Wilkinson have known each other since the early days of the Revolution. In the early 1800s, they exchanged letters in military cipher. Burr clearly expects Wilkinson to use his command in the West, the U.S. Army, to support his expedition, moving troops and supplies, or at the very least, looking away. One key piece of evidence is a cipher letter Burr sends Wilkinson in July 1806. It outlines plans for assembling men and boats, moving down the Mississippi River, and seizing territory. The exact wording is debated, but it clearly suggests military action that goes beyond legal boundaries. Spanish officials, according to their own records, worry that if this thing takes off, it could trigger a larger war that pushes Spain out of North America. At this stage, Wilkinson is not a neutral observer. He's a big part of the project.
So what changes his mind? Why does Wilkinson suddenly show up as Jefferson's hero witness?
As he does so many times throughout his career, Wilkinson reads the political weather vane and realizes he's in danger. By late 1806, rumors about Burr's activities are spreading. Newspapers talk about a Western conspiracy. Territorial governors are nervous. The Jefferson administration starts asking questions. Wilkinson sees and figures out two things. One, Burr's project doesn't have anywhere near the level of support he hoped for. And two, if the government calls this treason, Wilkinson himself is exposed as a collaborator. So he does what he has done repeatedly throughout his career. He flips to save his hide. In October 1806, he writes to Jefferson warning of a dangerous conspiracy in the West. At first, he doesn't even name Burr, presenting himself as the loyal officer who uncovered a plot. He then alters Burr's cipher letter, editing and translating it in ways that sharpen Burr's guilt and downplays his own role.
So you mean to tell me that the main document tying Burr to treason is edited by a co-conspirator just trying to cover himself?
Yes, at Burr's trial under cross-examination, Wilkinson has to admit he altered the letter. That blows a hole in his credibility. But politically, he's already given Jefferson exactly what the president wants, a narrative in which Burr is the mastermind and Wilkinson is the honest man who saved the country.
Let's talk about Jefferson's part in this. Was he just doing his duty, or was this a political hit?
Let me make one thing clear, Dr. Weaver. Jefferson is not neutral. He already despises Burr after the 1800 election tie and the years of rivalry that followed. When Wilkinson's letters arrive, Jefferson goes public. In a special message to Congress, he describes a serious conspiracy and portrays Burr as essentially guilty before any trial. He then orders Burr's arrest, sets the tone of the investigation, resists turning over some documents requested by Burr's defense team, what they call discovery in the law today, which leads to an early test of executive privilege. Now, Chief Justice John Marshall ends up ruling that the president isn't completely exempt from subpoenas in a criminal case. That becomes a very important precedent for limits on presidential power. So this case is not only about Burr's actions, it's also about how far a president can go while using the machinery of government against a political enemy.
So, walk us through the trial, Dr. Deneen. What exactly was Burr facing?
Well, the trial takes place in Richmond, Virginia in 1807 before Chief Justice John Marshall. He's what they call riding circuit. That's when Supreme Court judges handle local cases because of a limited number of local judges. There are two charges against Burr. The most serious one is treason, leveling war against the United States. The second one, which is only a misdemeanor, is organizing a military expedition against Spanish territory with which the United States is at peace. Now, the Constitution's treason clause is deliberately very strict. Treason means levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. It must be proven by two witnesses to the same overt act. That high bar is deliberate. The founders didn't want treason to become a catch-all charge for political opponents. The prosecution has a problem. They claim the overt act of treason occurred on Blennerhassett Island, where a group of Burr's supporters gathered with boats, money, and weapons. However, Burr is not physically present there when this meeting happens. Wilkinson's role is to provide intent, to portray Burr as the organizing brain behind everything. But on the stand, his Spanish connections are hinted at. He admits he alters Burr's cipher letter. His record going back before the revolution as a self-serving survivor is obvious. Burr's defense team argues, at worst, Burr planned an illegal expedition against Spain, not a direct attack on the United States. Conspiracy and intent alone do not meet the constitutional standard for treason. There must be a specific overt act with two witnesses, and Burr must be legally tied to that act. Justice Marshall agrees on the law. He rules that the government has not met the constitutional standard. The jury finds Burr not guilty of treason. Burr is also acquitted on the misdemeanor charge.
So legally, he wins, but he doesn't walk away clean.
Right. Legally, Burr wins. Both politically and personally, he loses. He's acquitted, but his reputation is ruined. Effigies of him are burned. His name, like Benedict Arnold, becomes shorthand for treachery. He goes to Europe, tries to sell grand schemes to various governments and fails over the next 30 years. He never regains real political power in the United States.
And what about our boy Wilkinson?
Wilkinson's reputation is damaged, but he avoids the punishment you'd expect. His credibility is shredded in the courtroom. Members of Congress and many observers see him as dishonest and potentially treasonous himself, but he escapes indictment, keeps serving in the army, is essentially bought off by the government, and remains influential into the War of 1812 period. Only later, when more Spanish documents and other evidence come to light, does the historical verdict become blunt. Wilkinson was one of the most corrupt senior officers in American history.
So Burr is essentially finished. Wilkinson limps on. Jefferson's image is mixed. Champion of the Republic to some, overreaching political operator to others.
Exactly. The one clear institutional winner is the Constitution's treason standard and Justice Marshall's interpretation of it. The case makes it very difficult for the government to stretch treason to cover vague conspiracies or unpopular speech.
I wonder if another takeaway, presidential overreach, was also addressed. And I think we're sort of facing that now.
Yes, I think you're right, Dr. Weaver. That happens repeatedly throughout history in the First World War with the Espionage Act and in Watergate, in the other impeachment trials of many of the leaders we've had. We see this pattern over and over again.
Absolutely. And I think you're right, Dr. Weaver. I think it's something that's relevant because it's still going on today in a very big way. So let's hit the big question now. Was Aaron Burr a traitor, a victim, or maybe even a mixture of both?
Most modern historians would say both. The evidence supports he did organize a private military expedition against a friendly state without authorization. He likely intended to seize at least some Spanish territory, probably in Mexico. He recruited men and money and promised them land and power. But the evidence does not specifically prove is a specific, fully developed plan to levy war against the United States itself or a concrete blueprint to break up the Union that meets the constitutional definition of treason. Now, where does Wilkinson fit into all this? He encourages Burr early on and positions himself as the key military partner. He shares in the vision of a Napoleonic style Western Empire, with himself very high in the hierarchy. And when the scheme starts to look dangerous to cover his ass, he flips at its evidence and sells himself literally to Jefferson as the man who protected the Republic.
So Burr is guilty of being reckless, secretive, and hungry for power. But the case doesn't prove constitutional treason.
That's right. Burr is not an innocent man. He's reckless and willing to risk war and instability for personal gain. But he's also targeted by a president who publicly announces and assumes his guilt, betrayed by a general who had every reason to lie, and tried in a climate loaded with fear and rumor. So Burr is both a would-be strongman and a victim of a corrupt witness and a political pressure.
So why? Why should anyone care about this case now, in today's time?
Because the Burr Wilkinson episode exposes three recurring problems in American history. As you said, Dr. Weaver, the first problem is presidential overreach. Jefferson's handling of the case shows how easily a president can shape public opinion and try to steer the justice system, especially against the political enemy. The second problem is compromised or corrupt intelligence sources. Wilkinson is a textbook example of a bad source. He's on a foreign payroll, forges documents, and has a long record of dishonesty. Yet he becomes the centerpiece of the prosecution's story. When your main witness is that compromised, the entire case is unstable. And the final problem is the importance of tight legal definitions. The strict definition of treason forces the government to prove real concrete action, not just mistakes, suspicious talk, or political opposition. That standard has protected American civil liberties ever since.
And Wilkinson himself ends up as a warning about what happens when you give enormous power to someone who puts self-preservation above everything else.
Wow, doesn't that sound familiar today, Dr. Weaver and Dr. Deneen?
It
It
sure
does.
enough, sure
Mhm.
enough does indeed.
So, putting on my historian's hat for a minute here, when we ask, was Aaron Burr a victim, the honest answer looks like this. He built and pushed a dangerous, unauthorized scheme, but he was almost destroyed using manipulated evidence and a politicized narrative. The Burr trial shows how fragile justice can be when ambition, fear, foreign money, and presidential power all collide. You've been listening to Things You Don't Know. I'm Dr. Sean Deneen with my good friends, Dr. William Weaver and Chandler Foster.
And next time, we'll look at another moment when ambition, national security, and the Constitution crash into each other in a courtroom.